Chapter 14, and now a word from our sponsor. As the week progressed, George and Harold got more and more swamped with homework. They stayed up later and later each night and got sicker and sicker. "Let's take a break and watch some TV," said George one morning as he wiped his nose. "Okay," said Harold with a sneeze. George turned on the TV and flipped through the channels. Suddenly he saw a familiar face. "Hey!" shouted Harold. "That's Mr. Meaner." "What's he doing on TV?" cried George. He turned up the volume, and the two boys watched Mr. Meaner's commercial in horror. "Are your kids annoying? Do they fight and whine and complain all the time? Do they refuse to eat anything but macaroni and cheese? Are they sucking the life out of ya? Well, Riddle Kid 2000 is here to help. Our scientifically proven formula will transform the most willful child into an obedient, respectful, and hardworking angel. And Riddle Kid 2000 has a full day's supply of vitamin C, so you can feel good about dosing your child with a narcotic that has never been tested for long-term effects. So turn your brat into a brown-noser with a Riddle Kid 2000. Riddle Kid 2000, the cure for childhood. "I knew something was wrong," said Harold, "but it looks even worse than I'd imagined. We better go to school and get to the bottom of this," said George. "But we're sick," cried Harold. "I can't even breathe through my nose." "Me neither," said George, "but a kid's gotta do what a kid's gotta do." Chapter 15, Disguise Falling. George and Harold rummaged through their houses until they found what they needed. There was no way they were going to show up at school looking like themselves again. They had learned that lesson in our last book. George and Harold needed a disguise, and it needed to be convincing. When they arrived at school, George changed into his costume behind the bushes and climbed onto Harold's shoulders. Then they headed into the building. Normally, any stranger entering Jerome Horowitz Elementary School would need a sign in the office and go through a security screening. But George and Harold noticed that things at school were a little more relaxed today. Their first clue was that there were no adults in the office. At least it looked that way. Upon closer inspection, they discovered that the school secretary, Miss Anthrop, was sound asleep on the floor under her desk. Some third graders were giving her a foot massage while the 6th grade AV club was answering the phone and filing papers. "That's weird," said George. George and Harold walked down the hallway. Things just got weirder and weirder. First, they noticed a brownish haze in the air. "I wonder what all that brown fog is all about," said George. "I don't know," said Harold. "I can't smell a thing because of my cold." "Me neither." As they roamed from room to room, they noticed that the other teachers were asleep too, and their students were doing all sorts of odd things with them. Some kids were giving the teachers massages, and others were shaving their teachers' beards, plucking their eyebrows, and giving them haircuts. The mathletes were filling out the teachers' tax forms, while the shop kids were washing all the cars in the faculty parking lot. Finally, George and Harold reached the cafeteria, where several teachers were lying on the lunch table getting ashiatsu massages and mani-pedis at the same time. "Boy, things sure have gotten a lot better around since Riddle Kid 2000 came along," said Missouri. "I'll say," said Miss Guided, "I was happy enough when my students were finally able to sit still and pay attention all day. But when I found out that they'd follow my every command without question, it changed my life." "Mine too," said Miss Directed. "I just sent my whole class over to my house. They are mowing my lawn, watering my garden, and painting my house as we speak." The three teachers all had a good laugh and drifted off into a relaxing, dreamy sleep. "Oh no!" cried Harold. "The teachers have turned all the kids into mindless slaves. We better get out of here before they turn us into slaves too." "Okay," said George with a wicked smile, "but first, let's have a little fun." Chapter 16, Happy Pranksgiving. "If all the kids in school are blindly following the orders of adults," said George, "then maybe they'll follow our orders too, since we're dressed like an adult. That makes sense, said Harold. Let's order everyone to stop following orders. Nah, said George. We've already used that joke in this book. I've got a better idea. So George and Harold went around the school whispering new orders to all the students. First, they whispered some new orders to the kids who were giving out free shaves and haircuts. Are you sure? Asked the children. Of course I'm sure, said George. I'm an authority figure. Very well, sir. Said the children. Next, they whispered some new orders to the kids who were filing out tax forms. Are you sure? Asked the children. I'm an adult, said George. Don't question me. All right, sir, said the children. Then they passed out permanent markers to another group of kids and whispered some new orders to them, too. Are you sure? Asked the children. Absolutely, said George. I'm a grown-up. I don't make mistakes. As you wish, said the children. The rest of the afternoon continued in much the same way, with George and Harold dishing out new orders to every kid they came across. We better get out of here, said Harold. These teachers are going to wake up pretty soon and they're not going to be very happy. Okay, said George. We can do the last one on our way home. As they headed back to their tree house, George and Harold stopped by Mr. Rected's place. His whole yard was filled with children mowing the lawn, watering the flower garden, and painting the house. George whispered some new orders to them as well. Are you sure? Asked the children. Sure, said George. Sure, I'm sure. Don't just use your brains. Just follow orders. Chapter 17. Wakey, wakey, big mistakey. George and Harold walked back to their treehouse feeling pretty good about themselves, but things were not looking so good for the teachers at school who were just waking up. Hey, shouted Miss Anthrop, somebody draw on my face with permanent markers while I was asleep. Mine too, shouted Miss Fit, and they spray painted my rear end. Me stinky. Fingers go here, pie goes here. Kick here. Somebody gave me a mohawk, cried Miss Ribble. Somebody shaved off my eyebrows and goofy glued them to my chin, wailed Miss Zuri. Somebody filled out my tax forms in Pig Latin and mailed them to the IRS, screamed Miss Labler. Miss Dakin rushed to the mirror. Thank goodness nobody did anything to me, she laughed. Hooray! Don't look now, cried Mr. Rustworthy, but a bunch of kids are out in the parking lot filling up our cars with low-fat cottage cheese. Ah! The teachers all rushed to the windows. What is the meaning of this? They shouted. We are following orders, said one of the children. Who gave you those orders? Screamed Mr. Krupp. An authority figure, said another kid. We never question authority figures. The teachers were outraged. They marched across town to the old abandoned building that Mr. Meaner had converted into a Riddle Kid 2000 spray can factory. Look what those kids did to us, Mr. Krupp shouted at Mr. Meaner. That stupid stinky spray of yours doesn't work. That's impossible, said Mr. Meaner. I'm going to get to the bottom of this. Chapter 18. Low-Fat Rider. Mr. Meaner ran back to school, climbed into his low-fat cottage cheese-filled car, and drove around the city. Even with his massive intelligent brain, he still couldn't figure out what had gone wrong. As he drove, he passed by a curious sight. A group of children were watering someone's house, mowing their flower garden, and painting their lawn. Mr. Meaner stopped his car and got out. What on earth are you children doing? He asked. We are following orders, said one of the kids. Who ordered you to do those things? Asked Mr. Meaner. A grown-up, said the kid. Grown-ups do not make mistakes. Mr. Meaner squished back into his car and peeled off. No adult will give those kinds of orders, Mr. Meaner concluded. This has to be the work of a child, and there's only one way to solve that problem. Mr. Meaner zoomed back into his factory and strapped himself into the Stinky Kong 2000 mecha suit he had been building all week. Somewhere in this town there are children hiding, Mr. Meaner said, and I'm gonna get 'em. Chapter 19. Let Us Spray. The genius gym teacher stomped out of his factory and headed down the street, spraying everything in sight with his hideous mecha spray armpits. Say hello to my stinky friends, he shouted. The horrible brown clouds rose up over the city, getting bigger and billowier as they spread out across the town. After several hours, George and Harold could see the brown clouds from their treehouse window. "There's that brown fog again," said George. "It won't be long before it reaches our neighborhood." "It's a good thing our noses are clogged up," said Harold. "We can't smell it, so we're immune." "Yeah, but our colds won't last forever," said George. "I'm already starting to feel better." "Uh-oh," said Harold. "We need to find an adult we can trust, and fast." George and Harold had no other choice but to ask their parents for help. The two desperate boys sneaked into Harold's house, where both of their families were sitting together, just finishing up dinner. "Thanks for inviting us over for supper," said George's dad. "It's always a pleasure," said Harold's mom. "Please let us clear the table," said Yesterday George. "What a splendid idea," said Yesterday Harold. "Then we shall wash the dishes and mop the floor. Oh, what fun we shall have!" George and Harold hid in the hallway, waiting for just the right moment to come in and tell everyone their terrible tale of woe. But before they got a chance, their parents began to talk. "I don't know what's come over those two boys lately," said George's dad, "but I like it." "Me too," said Harold's mom. "They've been really grown up for the past few days. It's like their whole personalities had changed," said George's mom. "What an improvement!" George and Harold looked at each other with sadness, then walked back to their treehouse, broken-hearted. "Aw, man," said Harold, "our parents like the new versions of us better than they like the us versions of us. We're gonna have to find some adults we can really trust," said George. "But who?" cried Harold. "I've got an idea," said George. George and Harold ran across town through the choking brown fog until they reached Melvin Sneedley's house. Luckily, Melvin's garage door was open. Even luckier, Melvin's glow-in-the-dark, time-traveling robo-squid suits were there, too. George climbed up into one of the cockpits and fired up the engine. The robo-squid in suit lunged forward and grabbed Harold in its tentacled arm. Then it slithered down the sidewalk while George set the controllers. "You know, we really shouldn't be taking this," said Harold. "It isn't ours." "Technically it is ours," said George. "Melvin only had one of these things, and we made the second one. You can't steal something you made yourself, can you?" "That's a good point," said Harold. George finishing setting the controllers and pressed the start button. The robo-squid suit shook and sputtered, then disappeared into a ball of blinding light. Chapter 20. Away we go! George and Harold were instantly transported 20 years into the future. Quickly, they ran up to an old lady sitting with their 23-year-old son. "Look, son," said the old lady. "A giant glow-in-the-dark robotic squid is carrying a little boy in one of its tentacles." "Sure it is, Mom," said her son. "Listen, you need to take your medication every day or it's not going to—" "Excuse me," said George. The 20-year-old looked up from his phone and screamed, "Ah, it's a giant glow-in-the-dark robotic squid carrying a little boy in one of its tentacles!" Yeah," said George. "Look, we need to borrow your cell phone. We're trying to locate George Beard." "You mean the author?" said the guy. Did you say author?" cried George excitedly. "Yeah," said the guy. "Everybody knows George Beard. He writes those Dogman graphic novels." "No way!" screamed George. He was so overcome with happiness he couldn't contain himself. The glow-in-the-dark time-traveling robo-squid suit jumped up and down, spun around, and danced a happy jig. "I write graphic novels in the future!" screamed George. "Oh yeah, I write graphic novels in the future!" "Settle down," cried Harold, who was starting to feel ill from all the dancing and jerking around. "You're acting too crazy, man. Show a little self-control, okay?" "Sorry," said George, setting Harold down. "Do you know where Mr. Beard lives?" George asked the guy. "Yeah, he lives up there on Echo Hills, next to that graphic novel artist," said the guy. "I think his name is, Harold Hutchings or something." "I'm Harold Hutchings or something!" screamed Harold as he jumped up and down, flipped somersaults, and ran around in circles like a crazy person. "I illustrate graphic novels in the future! Oh, baby, I illustrate graphic novels in the future!" "Come on, Mr. Self-Control," said George. "Let's go meet our future selves." Zong. Chapter 21. It's nice to meet me. George and Harold could hardly contain themselves as they rang the doorbell of George's future self. They were so excited they'd almost forgotten why they had come to the future in the first place. Soon George's future self came to the door. He looked a lot like George, only he was really, really old. He was almost 30. Old George recognized George and Harold immediately. "Holy Toledo!" cried old George. "Well, what are you guys doing here?" Old George's wife came to the door, too. "Don't be rude to your fans, honey," she said. "Invite them in. Make yourselves at home, boys." "These aren't my fans, dear," said old George. "They're us." "Us who?" asked Miss Beard. "It's Harold and me from when we were kids," said old George. George and Harold accepted Mrs. Beard's invitation and made themselves right at home. They gleefully tore through the house, checking all of old George's stuff. "Your future house is awesome," said Harold. "Thanks," said George. "I must admit I have pretty good taste." "Wow!" cried Harold. "You've even got your own pinball machine." "Cool!" exclaimed George. "I've always wanted one." "Can I play it?" asked Harold. "I guess so," said George. "After all, it's mine." "Look, Harold," cried George, "there's even a tree house in my backyard." That's not for us," said old George. "That's for our kids." "Our kids?" asked George. "I guess it's time you boys met the whole family," said Mrs. Beard. "I'll go round up the children. Honey, while you call Harold and Billy." Chapter 22. The gang was all here. Soon everyone had gathered together in old George's studio. Old George, his wife, and their kids, Mina and Nick, sat on the couch, while old Harold, his husband, and their twins, Owen and Kay, popped down in the giant beanbag chair. "Kids," said Miss Beard, "I'd like you to meet your fathers." "What's up?" said George. "We were dads when they were kids," said Harold. "Wow, Dad," said Mina, "you used to be cute." "What do you mean, used to be?" said George. "We're here because we need to borrow your dad," said Harold. "They're the only adults we can trust." "Yeah," said George, "it's a real emergency." "Wait a minute," said old Harold. "I don't remember doing any of this when we were kids. Do you, George?" "No," said old George. "If this happened in our past, how come we have no memory of it?" "I don't know," said Harold. "Probably bad writing," said George. "Well, if we're going to help you, we'd better get going," said old George. "Let's boogie." "But wait," said Harold. "We need to finish our pinball game." "Yeah," said George, "and we haven't even read your graphic novels yet." "I thought this was an emergency," said old Harold. "How about just one chapter?" Harold begged. "Please." "Well, all right," said old Harold. George and Harold grabbed a graphic novel from the bookshelf, flipped it open, and started reading from a random chapter. Chapter 23, Dogman, the Random Chapter. "No, Dogman! No, bad Dogman! How could you betray us like this, Dogman?" "Because I'm not Dogman!" Fling! Rustle, rustle. "Actually, I'm Petey, the world's most incorrigible cat. Petey, I thought you were dead." "That's what I wanted you to think." What happened to Dogman?" "Dogman is the one who was dead. Zip! My Venus flytrap monkeys have surely finished him up by now. Shung! And now, dear coppers, it is your turn to die." Whoosh! Clunk! "Hey, you broke my sword. You owe me $16. Crack! Whoosh! Shoom! "Do you give up or do you want some more?" Pow! Wah! "So you want to play rough, eh? Behold the rage and fear of my rocket fists." Whoosh! "Hey, you're not Petey, you're Mecha Petey." "Mecha Petey? I thought he was dead." "That's what I wanted you to think." Pop, pop. "And now you shall witness the defeat of the Bark Knight." "Not if I can help it." "Millie, don't be a hero. Don't be a fool with your life." "My mask." Clunk. "Hey, you're not Mecha Petey." "No, this time it's been me, Porkbelly, the world's most sinister psychokinetic angelfish." "Porkbelly? I thought he was dead." That's what I wanted you to think. To be continued. Chapter 24. Away we go again. Well, said old George, what do you think? Did you like it? I guess so, said Harold. Yeah, said George, it was pretty good for old people. Pretty good, cried old Harold. Old people, cried old George. All right, let's boogie, said George as he went to the front yard and powered up the robo-squid suit. Quickly, he reached out 3 mechanical arms and picked up old Harold, and old George. Suddenly, everything began to shake and sputter as a massive ball of electric light enveloped them all. Are you guys ready to go? Asked Harold. Pretty good, whined old Harold. All people, whined old George. As our heroes began to disappear into the shifting paradigms of time, they waved goodbye to their frightened families. Chapter 25. It was 20 years ago today. Everything stopped suddenly, and George, Harold, and their future selves looked down from the vacant hilltop. They were back in the present, and their entire city below them was surrounded by a gigantic, stinky brown cloud. Quickly, they made their way through the dark clouds to their tree house. Wow, cried old George. I haven't been up here in years. Look, cried old Harold, it's Tony, Orlando, and Dawn. I remember them. Yeah, whatever happened to them, said old George. It was like they just disappeared one day. I don't know what you're talking about, said Harold. They've always been here, ever since they hatched. Listen, boys, said old George, you need to stay up here. We'll take care of Mr. Meaner and the stinky gas. Yeah, said old Harold, it's up to the adults to save the world this time. The first thing that old George and old Harold did was run to Mr. Krupp's house. Unfortunately, Mr. Meaner was walking down Mr. Krupp's street at that very moment in his stinky Kong 2000 mecha suit, blowing brown, putrid fog throughout the neighborhood. Old George ran Mr. Krupp's doorbell, panicking. Suddenly, Mr. Krupp swung the front door open. He had been at his kitchen sink all evening, scrubbing the permanent marker off of his face. What do you people want? Shouted Mr. Krupp. We need the help of an old friend, said old Harold, snapping his fingers. Well, Mr. Krupp screamed, answer me! Old George and old Harold looked at each other in shock. It didn't work, cried old Harold. They both snapped their fingers this time. Snap, 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 snap. Hey! Mr. Krupp screamed. Quit snapping your fingers in my face, you weirdos! Mr. Meaner and his stinky Kong 2000 mecha suit were getting closer. Snap, 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 snap. The whole street shook with every forceful stomp of his metallic monkey feet. Old George and old Harold continued snapping their fingers feverishly. Why isn't it working? Cried old Harold as he snapped. It must be all that water that's on his face, cried old George. That's gotta be what's keeping him from transforming. Listen up, you two psychos, Mr. Krupp screamed. You better get out of my yard before I call the cops. You're supposed to be adults, but you're acting like a couple of kids. Suddenly, Mr. Meaner stopped. Adults acting like kids? He said, turning his head out slyly. He looked at old George and old Harold. His genius began to calculate rapidly as he eyed them up and down. Then his face widened with a sinister, foul-smelling smile. Adults who act like children would be immune to my Riddle Kid 2000 spray, Mr. Meaner said, though they must be the pranksters I've been looking for. Mr. Meaner stomped up to old George and old Harold and grabbed the two friends in the clenching claws of the stinking Kong 2000. Chapter 27, The Incredibly Graphic Violence Chapter Part 1 in Flip-O-Rama. The first time ever I punched your face. Killing me softly with his Kong.